The snowstorm that night was unlike any the North had seen in decades, even by the brutal standards of the frozen territories where winter never truly ended, and the cold was as much a part of the landscape as the ancient pine forests and jagged mountain peaks that scraped the steel-gray sky. The wind howled through the valleys like a living thing, hungry and vicious, tearing at anything foolish enough to be caught in its path. It was the kind of storm that wise wolves stayed inside for, huddled, close to fires and loved ones, telling old stories and thanking the moon goddess that they had walls between themselves and the merciless elements. But there were always a few who had no choice but to brave the darkness. And on this particular night, there were two souls moving through the blizzard, each driven by forces they could neither control nor fully understand. If you're enjoying this story of forbidden territories and destined encounters, please consider hitting that like button and letting me know in the comments what you think will happen when these two collide. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you these immersive, supernatural romances. Cale Nightborn stood at the northernmost watchtower of his palace, a structure of black stone and ice that rose from the mountainside like a crown of shadows, his silver eyes scanning the white expanse below with the preternatural vision that came with being not just an alpha, but a king among alphas. He did not feel the cold, had not felt it in any meaningful way since the night 15 years ago, when everything warm inside him had frozen solid. His people called him the Winter King, the silent sovereign, the alpha without mercy, and he had earned every title through years of ruthless efficiency and absolute authority. He rarely spoke anymore, finding that silence was often more effective than words, that a look from those ice-chip eyes could convey more threat than any verbal command. His kingdom was the most prosperous and secure in all the territories precisely because he ruled with an iron fist wrapped in permafrost, because he had no weakness that enemies could exploit, no soft spots where a knife could slip between the ribs. He had built walls not just around his borders, but around his heart. And for 15 years those walls had held perfectly, keeping out anything that might make him vulnerable again. The bond mark on his neck, the one that should have connected him to his true mate, had been severed in the most brutal way possible all those years ago. A magical attack that had not only killed his young mate before they could complete their bond, but had shattered something fundamental in his ability to feel. The healers had saved his life, but they could not restore what had been taken. That capacity for warmth and trust, and the kind of love that made alphas do foolish, beautiful things. In the aftermath, Cale had made a choice that he had never once questioned in all the years since. If he could not be whole, he would be strong. If he could not love, he would protect. If his people could not have a king with a soft heart, they would have one whose strength was absolute and whose determination to keep them safe was unwavering. The North had thrived under his rule, its borders secure, its people fed and housed and defended from the chaos that plagued the other territories. They feared him? Yes, but they also depended on him. And that was enough. It had to be enough because it was all he had left to give. But tonight something was wrong. Cale could feel it in the way his wolf paced restlessly beneath his skin, agitated in a way it had not been in years, whining and clawing like it was trying to tell him something his rational mind refused to hear. He had learned to trust these instincts even when he did not understand them. So when his beta arrived at the watchtower with news that the perimeter wards had detected an intrusion at the southern border, Cale was already moving, already reaching for his heavy cloak and calling for his mount. An intrusion was serious, a violation of the laws that everyone in the territories knew and respected, because the consequences were always lethal. No one crossed into the North without permission. No one was foolish enough to try. The fact that someone had attempted it tonight, in the middle of a storm that should have made travel impossible, meant either desperation or stupidity, and Cale intended to discover which before he delivered the punishment that law demanded. He rode hard through the blizzard, his massive black wolf carrying him with sure-footed grace over terrain that would have killed a lesser creature, following the pull of the wards and something else, something deeper that he could not name, but that drew him forward with increasing urgency. When he finally reached the border marker, a line of ancient stones carved with protective runes that glowed faintly blue in the darkness. He found his guards already there, their torches creating circles of golden light in the swirling white chaos. They parted for him immediately, showing the deference and fear that all his subjects displayed in his presence, and one of them gestured toward a shape in the snow just beyond the border stones. At first, Cale thought it was just a drift, or perhaps a fallen log, but then he saw the dark spreading stain that even the fresh snowfall could not quite cover, and his wolf lurched forward so violently that he nearly lost control of his human form. She was small, impossibly small to have survived even this far, and she was bleeding from multiple wounds that painted the snow around her in shocking crimson contrast. Her clothes were torn and inadequate for the weather, marking her clearly as someone from the southern territories where winters were mild and alphas were weak. She should have been dead already, frozen or bled out, or simply given up beneath the crushing weight of the storm and her injuries. But somehow she was still breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps that sent small clouds of steam into the frozen air. And when Cale knelt beside her and carefully turned her over, the scent that hit him was like being struck by lightning. Orange blossoms and summer rain, warmth and growing things. Everything his frozen kingdom was not. Everything he had not let himself want for 15 years. Because wanting led to loss. And loss led to the kind of pain that could break even a king. She was Omega, he realized with a shock that went soul deep. And not just any Omega, but his Omega. The mate bond slamming into place with such force that it drove the air from his lungs and sent his wolf into a frenzy of possession and protectiveness that he had thought himself incapable of feeling ever again. Subscribe to the channel to follow this journey of two broken souls, finding unexpected connection in the frozen north. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. For several long moments, Cale simply knelt there in the snow, staring at the unconscious woman who had just destroyed 15 years of careful emotional control with nothing more than her presence, trying to process what was happening, while his guards waited nervously and the storm raged around them. The law was clear. She had crossed the border without permission, had violated the sanctity of his territory, and the punishment was death. He had enforced this law, dozens of times without hesitation, because borders meant nothing if they were not defended, because allowing one exception would invite chaos. But she was his mate, that bond humming between them like a living thing, even though she was unconscious and unaware. And the thought of harming her, of following through with the execution that law demanded, made something howl in protest deep in his chest, where he had been certain nothing could howl anymore. His beta was watching him carefully, clearly, seeing the conflict written across a face that usually showed nothing, waiting for orders that Cale found himself suddenly unable to give. Finally, Cale stood, gathering the woman into his arms with a gentleness that surprised even him, feeling how cold she was, how fragile, how close to death, despite the mate bond that now tied them together. He looked at his beta and said in a voice that had not been used for anything but commands in years, "She will be taken to the palace. No one speaks of this. No one questions it. Anyone who does will wish they had not." It was not an explanation, barely even an order, just a statement of fact delivered in a tone that made it clear the subject was closed. His guards bowed immediately, recognizing the absolute authority in his words, even if they did not understand it. And Cale turned back toward his mount, cradling his unexpected mate against his chest and trying not to think about how right she felt there, how perfectly she fit against him, how her scent was already starting to calm the beast that had been raging inside him for 15 years. The ride back to the palace was surreal, Cale's mind racing even as his body moved on autopilot, following familiar paths through the storm, while he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The mate bond was supposed to be impossible for him, the magical attack that had killed his first mate having damaged him in ways that should have prevented this kind of connection from ever forming. Again, the healers had been clear about that, had told him in their careful, pitying way that he would never bond again, that whatever capacity he had once had for that kind of soul-deep connection had been burned away along with everything else warm and good inside him. They had been wrong, clearly, but that raised questions he was not prepared to answer. Why now? Why her? What did it mean that the goddess had sent him a second chance when he had been so certain he neither wanted nor deserved? One? And what was he supposed to do with an Omega mate who had quite literally thrown herself into his territory while fleeing something terrible enough to make her risk certain death? When they reached the palace, Kel carried her directly to his private chambers, ignoring the shocked stares of servants and guards who had never seen their king show concern for anyone, never seen him move with anything approaching tenderness. He laid her on his own bed, a massive structure of carved black wood, and white furs that had not held anyone but himself in 15 years, and immediately called for the head healer, an ancient wolf woman named Mara, who had served his family for 3 generations, and who was one of the few people in the kingdom who did not actively fear him. Mara took one look at the woman bleeding on the king's bed, and then at Kale's face, and whatever she saw there made her simply nod and get to work without asking the questions that were clearly burning on her tongue. Injuries were extensive, Mara reported as she worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning wounds and applying salves and wrapping bandages, while Kyle stood nearby radiating tension. Multiple deep cuts from what looked like claws, suggesting she had been attacked by other wolves. Severe cold exposure and the beginning stages of hypothermia. Exhaustion so profound it bordered on complete system collapse. Malnutrition indicating she had been on the run for quite some time. But nothing fatal. Nothing that would not heal given time and care. And most importantly, nothing that would prevent her from waking up once her body had recovered enough. Kale felt something loosen in his chest at that assessment, relief so intense it was almost painful, and had to turn away so Mara would not see how much it affected him. When the healer finally finished and left with strict instructions that her patient needed rest and absolutely no stress, Kale found himself alone with his unconscious mate, standing beside the bed and trying to figure out what happened next. He should have been planning, strategizing, thinking through all the political and practical implications of what he had just done. By bringing her here, by saving her instead of executing her as law demanded, he had created a situation that would have consequences he could not yet fully predict. His enemies, and he had many despite the fear he inspired, would see this as weakness, as proof that the unshakable Winter King could be moved after all. His allies would be confused, uncertain about what this meant for the careful balance of power he had maintained. And his own people would whisper, would wonder, would ask questions he had no good answers for. But instead of worrying about any of that, Kale found himself simply watching her breathe, studying the face he had barely glimpsed in the snow, and seeing it properly for the first time. She was beautiful in an understated way, not the flashy, dramatic beauty of Southern Omegas who painted their faces and wore elaborate clothes, but something quieter and more real. Dark hair that would probably be curly when it was not matted with blood and snow. A face that was too thin but showed the structure of someone who would be striking when properly fed. Hands that were calloused and scarred, marking her as someone who had worked hard, who had survived things that should have broken her. Over the next 3 days while she slept, Kyle found himself spending more and more time in his chambers, making excuses to be near her, even though there was no rational reason for it. He had a kingdom to run, reports to review, decisions to make, but somehow none of it seemed as important as sitting beside the bed and watching over this Omega who had disrupted his entire carefully constructed existence. He told himself he was simply ensuring she survived, that he needed to be present when she woke so he could question her about what she was running from and what she knew about his borders. But the truth was something he was not quite ready to acknowledge. The mate bond that had slammed into place when he first touched her had not faded with time or distance. Instead, it had grown stronger, more insistent, a constant awareness of her presence that hummed beneath everything else he did. He could feel her pain when it spiked, could sense when she was falling into troubled dreams, could track every slight improvement in her condition like his own body was experiencing it. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, this sudden connection after years of feeling nothing at all. And Kyle had no idea what to do with it. Drop a comment below telling me whether you think she'll accept him when she wakes or reject the mate bond. I love reading your predictions and theories. When she finally opened her eyes late on the third night, Cale was there, sitting in a chair he had pulled close to the bed, while pretending to read reports that he had not actually processed a single word of. He felt the exact moment her consciousness returned, the bond flaring bright between them, and looked up to find himself staring into eyes the color of amber, warm and cautious, and completely disoriented. For several long moments, they simply looked at each other, predator and prey, king and refugee, mate and mate, while she clearly tried to figure out where she was and how she had gotten there, and whether she was in immediate danger. Cale kept himself perfectly still, knowing that any sudden movement would spook her, letting her look her fill and assess the situation on her own terms, even though his wolf was screaming at him to move closer, to touch her, to mark her properly so everyone would know she belonged to him. Finally she spoke, her voice rough from disuse and pain, but still carrying that musical quality that seemed to go with Omega vocal cords. I'm alive. It was not a question, just a statement of confused fact, as if she had expected to wake up in the afterlife, rather than in a palace bedchamber surrounded by luxury she had probably never experienced before. Cale nodded once, not trusting himself to speak yet, and she continued studying him with those sharp amber eyes that seemed to miss nothing. You're the Winter King. Cale Nightborn, the Alpha without mercy. Again, not a question, just recognition, and he saw fear flicker across her face before she controlled it, replacing it with resignation that somehow hurt worse than terror. Would have. She thought he was going to kill her, he realized. She had woken up in the home of the most feared alpha in all the territories, and was simply waiting for the execution she knew she deserved by law. I am, Cale confirmed, his voice coming out rougher than intended after days of not using it for anything but short commands. And you are a trespasser who crossed my borders without permission, which means by law, you should already be dead. He watched her throat move as she swallowed. Hard, watched her fingers curl into the furs beneath her. But she did not look away, did not beg or plead or try to bargain, just nodded slightly, accepting her fate with a dignity that made something ache in his chest. But, he continued, forcing himself to say words that went against 15 years of ruthless consistency. You are also my mate, which complicates things considerably. The shock that went through her was visible, her eyes going wide, and her scent spiking with emotions too. Complex to parse, surprise and disbelief and something that might have been horror all mixed together. No, she said flatly, shaking her head despite the obvious pain the movement caused. That's not possible. I don't have a mate. I would have known, would have felt something before now. But even as she said it, Cale could see awareness dawning, could feel through the bond the exact moment she recognized what was humming between them, that connection that had not been there before she crossed his borders, but was undeniable now. She paled, what little color she had gained during her recovery draining away, and for a moment, he thought she might actually try to run despite her injuries and the impossibility of escape. I did not expect it either, Cale said, keeping his voice carefully neutral, even though his wolf was going crazy at her rejection, at the idea that she might refuse the bond that felt like the first real thing he had experienced in years. The healers told me I could not bond again after my first mate was killed. They were apparently incorrect. He saw curiosity flicker in her eyes at that, questions forming, but she kept them to herself, clearly not ready to ask about his past when her own present was so precarious. I have brought you to my palace and had you healed despite the fact that by law, I should have executed you at the border. I need to understand what you were running from, why you took such a desperate risk, and what you know about my kingdom's defenses. She laughed at that, a bitter sound that held no humor at all. You think I'm a spy? That someone sent me to infiltrate the impenetrable north? She shook her head again, more carefully this time. I'm nobody. A renegade Omega with no pack and no family, running from an alpha who decided I would make a good trophy wife and did not particularly care that I disagreed with that assessment. I crossed your border because I was being hunted, because it was cross or die, and I chose to take My chances with the infamous Winter King, rather than let Cassius Blackwater drag me back to his compound in chains. She said the name with such venom that it made Cale's hackles rise, made his wolf snarl with protective fury at the idea of anyone hunting what was his. The name Blackwater meant something, Cale knew. Cassius Blackwater was a Southern alpha with a reputation for cruelty and a taste for collecting beautiful things, including omegas he acquired through methods that were technically legal but morally reprehensible. He was also someone Cale had been watching carefully for years, suspicious that the Southern alpha was building power in ways that would eventually become a problem for the North. If this woman, his mate, had been running from Blackwater, then the situation was even more complicated than he had realized, because refusing to return her would be seen as an act of aggression by the Southern territories, a violation of the agreements that kept the various Alpha Kings from open warfare. "Tell me everything," Cale commanded, settling back in his chair and preparing to listen. And after a moment of hesitation, she did. Her name was Sarah Ashwood, and her story was depressingly common in the Southern territories where Omegas had fewer protections and Alphas operated with near impunity. She had been born into a small pack, nothing special, had lost both her parents to illness when she was young, and had spent most of her life trying to make herself useful enough that she would not be thrown out. She had worked hard, learned practical skills, kept her head down and tried not to attract attention because attention from Alphas rarely ended well for Omegas who had no powerful family to protect them. For years, that strategy had worked perfectly fine, allowing her to live a quiet, if unremarkable life on the edges of pack society. But then, 6 months ago, Cassius Blackwater had visited her pack for some political negotiation, had seen her serving at a dinner, and had decided he wanted her. He had made an offer to her alpha, a generous one by Southern standards, essentially buying her like she was property to be traded. Her alpha had accepted without consulting her, had told her she should be grateful that such a powerful alpha was interested, had made it clear that refusing was not an option if she wanted to keep her place in the pack. Sarah had smiled and nodded and appeared to comply, right up until the night before the bonding ceremony when she had packed a small bag and run, knowing that once Blackwater marked her, she would be trapped forever in a life she could not stomach. She had been on the run ever since, moving from territory to territory, taking odd jobs and sleeping rough, always staying ahead of the hunters that Blackwater had sent after her, because apparently he was not the kind of alpha who accepted rejection gracefully. The hunters had finally caught up to her 3 nights ago, just as she reached the southern edge of the frozen territories. They had attacked without warning, clearly intending to drag her back dead or alive, and in desperation she had done the only thing she could think of. She had crossed the border into the north, gambling that even the Winter King's reputation for mercilessness was preferable to what waited for her in the south. "I did not expect to survive," she admitted quietly, looking down at her bandaged hands rather than meeting his eyes. "I thought you would kill me quickly, which seemed better than whatever Blackwater had planned. I certainly never expected to wake up in a palace being told I'm mated to a king." She finally looked up at him then, and there was something vulnerable in her expression that made Cale's chest tight. "I don't want a mate. I don't want to belong to anyone, to be owned or controlled or told what to do with my life. I came north for freedom, not another cage, even if this one has nicer bars." The words hit harder than they should have, cutting through Cale's careful control and making his wolf snarl with hurt and anger because she was rejecting them, pushing them away, comparing them to the alpha who had tried to force her into bonding. He wanted to argue, to explain that he was nothing like Blackwater, that he would never force her into anything, but the truth was more complicated than that. He had not asked if she wanted to be saved. He had not given her a choice about being brought to his palace, or having her wounds healed, or being told about the mate bond that now connected them. He had simply taken action based on what he wanted, what his wolf demanded, without considering that she might have preferred to make her own decisions, even if those decisions led to her death. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next in this complex dance between duty, desire, and the right to choose your own fate. "I am not Blackwater," Cale said, finally, forcing the words out past the tightness in his throat. And you are not my prisoner, whatever you might think. The mate bond does not make you my property. It simply means we are connected, that we have the potential for something if we both choose it. But it is a choice, Sarah. I will not force you into anything. The words cost him more than he wanted to admit, his wolf howling in protest at the idea of letting her go. But he meant them. He had spent 15 years ruling through fear and control, taking what he wanted and destroying anything that threatened him. And it had kept his kingdom safe, but it had also kept him isolated and half alive. If this unexpected second chance meant anything, it had to mean choosing a different path, even if that path was harder and more uncertain. Sarah was staring at him like he had grown a second head, clearly not having expected that response from the king, whose reputation was built on absolute authority and zero tolerance for defiance. You're saying I can leave? Just walk out of here and you won't stop me? Skepticism in her voice was cutting, but not undeserved given everything she had experienced with Southern alphas. Cale nodded slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to lock her in his chambers, where she would be safe and his, to mark her properly so every wolf in the territories would know she was claimed, to simply take what the bond offered and deal with her objections later. I am saying that if you truly want to leave, I will not stop you, he confirmed, each word feeling like glass in his throat. But I would ask that you stay, at least for a time. You are still healing from serious injuries. You have nowhere to go, and no resources to get there. Blackwater is still hunting you, and he has enough influence in the south that you will never be safe there. And whether you want to acknowledge it or not, we are mated now, which means I have a responsibility to protect you, even if you choose not to complete the bond. He leaned forward slightly, holding her gaze with an intensity that made color rise in her cheeks. Stay. Give yourself time to heal. Let me prove that I am not the monster the stories make me out to be. And if after all that you still want to leave, I will help you find somewhere safe to go, somewhere Blackwater cannot reach you. It was possibly the longest speech Cale had given in years. Certainly the most emotionally vulnerable thing he had said since before his first mate died. And he felt raw and exposed in its aftermath. Sarah continued to study him with those sharp amber eyes, clearly trying to decide if she could trust him, if this was some elaborate trap or a genuine offer of sanctuary. Finally, she said, "Why? If what they say about you is true, you don't do kindness. You don't make exceptions or show mercy. You're the alpha who rules through fear and has no weakness. So why would you offer protection to a renegade Omega who violated your borders and brought you nothing but political complications?" It was a fair question, one Cale had been asking himself since the moment he picked her up in the snow. The easy answer was the mate bond, that biological imperative that made him want to protect and provide for her regardless of logic or strategy. But the real answer was more complicated. Something about how she had looked so small and broken in that snowbank, how she had chosen potential death over captivity, how she had told him she did not want to be owned with such fierce conviction that it reminded him of who he used to be before grief and loss had frozen him solid. She was choosing freedom even when it might kill her, and that kind of strength deserved to be honored, not crushed. Because, he said slowly, working through the words as he said them, I have spent 15 years being exactly what you described. The alpha without mercy, the king who rules through fear, the monster who destroys anyone who threatens him or his kingdom. And it has worked. My people are safe, my borders are secure, my enemies respect me even as they hate me. But I am so tired, Sarah. Tired of being alone. Tired of feeling nothing. Tired of being feared by everyone, including those I am trying to protect. You walked into my territory and disrupted everything I had carefully constructed. And maybe that is exactly what I needed, even if I did not know it. He felt his throat work, emotion threatening to break through the walls he had maintained for so long. I cannot promise I will be good at this. I cannot promise I know how to be anything other than what I have been. But I would like to try, if you will let me. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and danger, the space between them charged with the mate bond and all the complicated emotions it brought with it. Finally, Sarah nodded, just a small dip of her head. But it felt like a victory that made Cale's wolf settle for the first time since he had found her in the snow. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "For now, while I heal, but I'm not making any promises beyond that. And if I decide to leave, you have to keep your word about helping me find somewhere safe." Her tone made it clear she did not entirely trust that he would, that she was taking a calculated risk, but keeping her guard up, and Cale could not blame her for that caution. "Agreed," he said simply, and something settled between them. Not quite trust, but the beginning of it, a foundation they could maybe build on if they were both willing to try. Over the following weeks, as Sarah recovered from her injuries and began to explore the palace that was now her temporary home, an unusual dynamic developed between them. Cale had not courted anyone since his first mate, had forgotten how to do anything romantic or tender, so instead, he simply tried to show through actions what he could not quite articulate with words. He made sure she had everything she needed, comfortable clothes in her size and good food, and access to the palace library when she mentioned she liked to read. He gave her space, but made himself available when she sought him out, answering her questions about his kingdom and his past, with an honesty that surprised them both. He introduced her to his most trusted advisors, and made it clear she was under his personal protection, which meant anyone who threatened or disrespected her would answer to him directly. Sarah, for her part, remained cautious but curious, clearly trying to reconcile the reputation she had heard with the reality she was experiencing. The Winter King, who was supposed to be cold and cruel, kept showing her small kindnesses, kept respecting her boundaries, even when she could feel through the bond how much it cost him. He never pushed her toward the physical aspects of mating, never demanded anything from her, just seemed content to share space and conversation, and slowly, carefully, build something that might eventually become trust. She started to see glimpses of who he must have been before tragedy changed him, moments when he almost smiled at something she said, or when he got passionate talking about improvements he wanted to make to his kingdom's infrastructure, or when he sat beside her in comfortable silence while they both read in his study. But the peace they were building was fragile, and threats were gathering that neither of them fully appreciated yet. Cassius Blackwater had not given up his hunt for Sarah, and when his trackers reported that she had crossed into the frozen territories and disappeared, he had taken it as a personal insult that demanded response. He began spreading rumors in the southern territories, painting Sarah as a spy who had seduced the Winter King, suggesting that Cale's protection of her was proof the Northern Alpha was not as strong as everyone thought. He called for her return, cited old laws about Omegas belonging to the Alphas who claimed them first, and started building a coalition of Southern Alphas who were happy to have an excuse to challenge the Northern King, who they had always resented for his power and independence. At the same time, there were forces within Cale's own kingdom who saw Sarah's presence as an opportunity to finally bring down the king, who had ruled them with absolute authority for 15 years. Not everyone was happy with Cale's methods, even if they had kept the North safe and prosperous. There were alphas who resented taking orders from anyone, betas who thought they could do better, omegas who had been harmed by the strict laws that Cale enforced without exception. A small group of conspirators, led by a bitter alpha named Tyrell, who had once been Cale's friend before a disagreement drove them apart, began plotting to use Sarah as leverage to force Cale into either backing down or exposing weakness they could exploit. Let me know in the comments if you've been enjoying the slow build between these two, and whether you think they'll complete the mate bond before external forces tear them apart. The crisis came. To a head 6 weeks after Sarah had crossed the border, on the night of the winter solstice when the North celebrated its most important festival, and alphas from allied territories gathered at the palace for ceremonies and political negotiations. Kyle had been reluctant to expose Sarah to the crowds and scrutiny, but she had insisted on attending, had said she was tired of hiding, and wanted to understand the kingdom she was living in. He had given in because he was discovering he had trouble, denying her anything when she asked directly, and so she stood beside him in the great hall wearing a dress of deep blue that made her eyes glow like captured sunlight, playing the role of the king's companion, even though they had not completed their bond, and she still kept an emotional distance he could feel through their connection. The attack came during the formal dinner, coordinated and vicious and clearly planned by someone who knew the palace security intimately. Tyrell's conspirators moved simultaneously, some creating diversions while others went directly for Sarah, clearly intending to kidnap her and use her as a bargaining chip to force Cale's hand. But what they had not counted on was how completely the mate bond had changed the Winter King, how the alpha who had been frozen solid for 15 years would react when his mate was threatened. Kyle moved with a speed and ferocity that shocked even his own guards, cutting through the attackers like they were nothing. His wolf, completely unleashed for the first time since the night his first mate died. He reached Sarah just as one of the conspirators grabbed her arm, and the snarl that tore from his throat was pure alpha dominance, the kind of sound that made every wolf in the vicinity drop to their knees in submission. The fight was brutal but brief, Cale's absolute authority and superior strength making the outcome inevitable once he engaged directly. Within minutes, all the conspirators were subdued, including Tyrell, who Kyle held pinned to the floor with one hand wrapped around his former friend's throat. The rage burning through him was so intense, it felt like it might consume him. The need to destroy anyone who had dared threaten his mate overwhelming every other thought. He could feel his control slipping, feel himself getting ready to simply crush Tyrell's windpipe and deal with the political consequences later, when a small hand touched his shoulder and Sarah's voice cut through the red haze clouding his vision. "Kale, stop. You've won. They're defeated. Killing him now would just make you the monster they say you are." Her voice was steady, despite everything that had just happened, her amber eyes meeting his silver ones with complete trust that somewhere under the rage, he was still the male who had promised her choices, who had spent weeks showing her kindness, even when it went against his nature. "I'm safe. You protected me. Now show them you're also strong enough to choose mercy when it matters." It was possibly the hardest thing Cale had ever done, harder than surviving his first mate's death, harder than building a kingdom from fear and isolation. But he released Tyrell and stepped back, his chest heaving and his wolf still snarling, but under control again. He looked around the hall at all the witnesses to what had just happened, allied alphas and his own people, and knew that what he said next would define how the North was governed going forward. Tyrell and his co-conspirators will be exiled from the frozen territories effective immediately, he announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the massive space. "They have forfeited their right to my protection and their citizenship here, but I will not execute them because my mate is right. I am strong enough to choose mercy when it serves justice better than death." The shock that went through the crowd was palpable, whispers starting immediately, because the Winter King did not show mercy, did not make exceptions, and certainly did not take advice from an unmated Omega in front of his entire court. But Cale ignored all of it, turning to Sarah and checking her over carefully for injuries, needing to confirm with his own hands that she was truly unharmed. She let him fuss, understanding somehow that he needed the reassurance even though she was clearly fine. And when he finally pulled her into his arms and buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent and letting it calm his still, racing heart, she did not pull away. "Thank you," he murmured against her temple, quiet enough that only she could hear, "for stopping me, for trusting me enough to believe I could be stopped." She made a soft sound that might have been a laugh or a sob and wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him just as tightly, and Cale felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen for so long he had forgotten what warmth felt like. In the aftermath of the attack, several things became clear very quickly. First, that the conspirators had been working with Cassius Blackwater, who had been feeding them information and resources in exchange for their promise to deliver Sarah back to him once Cale was weakened or deposed. Second, that Cale's show of mercy had actually strengthened his position rather than weakening it, proving to his people and his allies that he was capable of nuance and growth rather than just brutal efficiency. And third, that whatever had been building between Cale and Sarah had fundamentally shifted during those terrifying minutes when she had been in danger and he had nearly lost control completely. They ended up back in his chambers late that night, after hours of dealing with the political fallout, both exhausted and running on adrenaline that was slowly wearing off. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed they had been carefully not discussing for weeks, still wearing the torn blue dress from the attack, and Cale stood by the window looking out at the snow-covered kingdom he had spent 15 years protecting while keeping everyone at arm's length. Finally, he spoke without turning around, his voice rough with emotions he was still learning how to process. "I almost lost you tonight. Almost watched you be taken by wolves who wanted to use you to hurt me, who saw you as nothing more than a tool to achieve their goals. And I realized something standing there with my hand around Tyrell's throat." He did turn then, meeting her eyes across the space between them. "I have been telling myself that I was keeping distance because I wanted to give you choices, because I did not want to pressure you into completing a bond you did not ask for. But the truth is, I was afraid, terrified actually, because caring about someone, letting someone matter, that is how you get destroyed. I know because it happened to me once already, and it broke something in me that took 15 years to even begin healing." Sarah stood up, moving toward him slowly like she was approaching a spooked animal, and took his hands in hers, her smaller fingers threading through his much larger ones. "I'm scared too," she admitted softly, "terrified that if I let myself trust this, trust you, it will turn into the kind of cage I've been running from, that the mate bond will become just another way to control me, to take away my choices. But I also realized something tonight, when you were fighting to protect me, and when you actually listened, when I asked you to choose. Mercy. You could have ignored me. You could have done what you wanted regardless of what I said. But you didn't. You chose to hear me even when your instincts were screaming something different. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happens next between these two is going to redefine what it means to be mates in the wolf territories." "I don't know how to do this," Cale confessed, the words coming out rough and uncertain. "How to be someone's mate, how to let someone in after years of keeping everyone out, how to balance what my wolf wants with what is right for you. I am going to make mistakes. I am going to mess this up probably more often than I get it right. But I want to try, Sarah. If you're willing to try with me." He brought their joined hands up to his chest, pressing her palm against his heart so she could feel how hard it was racing. "Complete the bond with me. Not because you have to, or because the mate bond demands it, but because you choose to, because you believe we could build something real together." She looked up at him, amber eyes searching his face for something, and whatever she found there must have been enough, because she nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered. "I choose this. I choose you. Not the Winter King, not the Alpha without mercy, but Cale Nightborn who saves renegade Omegas in snowstorms and promises them choices he does not have to give, who fights like a demon to protect what is his, but listens when I ask him to choose. Differently. That is who I want to be mated to." The bonding was nothing like Cale's first one had been. No elaborate ceremony or pack witnesses. Just the two of them in the quiet of his chambers making promises they both meant to keep. When he marked her, feeling his fangs sink into the soft skin where her neck met her shoulder, feeling the bond snap completely into place, and suddenly being able to feel everything she felt, every emotion and thought and sensation, it was overwhelming enough that his knees nearly buckled. And when she marked him in return, her smaller teeth leaving a perfect impression over his pulse point, claiming him just as thoroughly as he had claimed her, Cale felt something inside him finally settle. That frozen place that had been empty for 15 years, suddenly full of warmth and light, and the absolute certainty that he was no longer alone. The aftermath of their bonding rippled through the territories with surprising speed, and even more surprising results. Cassius Blackwater, who had been building his coalition of Southern Alphas to demand Sarah's return, found that none of his allies wanted to challenge the Winter King over his completed mate, especially not after the rumors spread about how Cale had fought to protect her. Blackwater tried to continue his campaign, but without support he was just one angry alpha shouting into the void, and eventually even he had to accept defeat and move on to easier prey. The conspirators who had been exiled from the north found no welcome in other territories, their betrayal of their king marking them as untrustworthy, and several of them eventually sent requests to Cale asking for forgiveness and the possibility of return. He considered each case individually, showing mercy where it was earned and remaining firm where it was not. developing a reputation for fairness that slowly began to replace his old reputation for mercilessness. Within the North itself, Sarah's presence began to change, things in ways both subtle and profound. She advocated for reforms to laws that disproportionately harmed Omegas and weaker pack members, arguing that true strength meant protecting the vulnerable rather than just enforcing absolute order. Kale listened, really listened, and started making changes that his advisors had been too afraid to suggest for years. He established councils where common wolves could bring complaints directly to the king's attention. He softened punishments for minor infractions while maintaining firm justice for serious crimes. He began actually talking to his people, rather than just commanding them, letting them see glimpses of the male behind the crown. It was slow work, and not everyone appreciated the changes. But gradually the frozen territories transformed from a kingdom ruled by fear into one led with strength, tempered by compassion. For Sarah, who had spent most of her life invisible and powerless, becoming the mate of the Winter King was a surreal experience that took considerable adjustment. She had to learn how to navigate court politics, how to use her new position to help others without overstepping her authority, how to be a public figure when she had always preferred staying in the shadows. But Kale was patient with her learning curve, supporting her initiatives even when they made his life more complicated, standing beside her when other alphas questioned her right to speak on policy matters, slowly teaching her that having power did not mean losing freedom if you chose to use that power wisely. Their relationship continued to evolve in those first months after the bonding, moving from uncertain beginnings to genuine partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. They learned each other's rhythms and preferences, discovered shared interests they had not expected, worked through disagreements without letting them become destructive. Kyle slowly opened up about his first mate and the trauma of losing her, allowing Sarah to understand why he had built such high walls and helping her see that choosing to lower them for her was not something he did lightly. Sarah shared her own history more completely, the years of feeling powerless and invisible, the fear that had driven her north, and Kale made sure she knew that she would never be invisible or powerless again, not as long as he lived. There were still challenges, of course, moments when Kale's old instincts toward control clashed with Sarah's need for independence, times when Sarah's deep-seated fear of captivity made her push away the very intimacy she craved, political situations that tested their united front. But they faced these challenges together, learning to communicate even when it was hard, choosing to trust even when trust felt risky, slowly building the kind of bond that was about far more than just biological imperative. If you've made it this far in their journey, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves supernatural romance with real emotional depth. 1 year after Sarah had crossed the border in a desperate bid for freedom, the frozen territories celebrated the winter solstice again. But this time the festival was very different from the one that had been interrupted by assassination attempts and political conspiracy. The Great Hall was full of wolves from across the north, and even some from allied territories, all gathered to witness the formal presentation of their queen, because Sarah had finally agreed to accept the crown she had been avoiding for months. She stood beside Kyle on the dais, wearing silver and white that made her look like she had been carved from moonlight, and when he placed the circlet on her head that marked her as his equal in rule and authority, the cheers that went up were genuine and enthusiastic. Kale gave a speech that night that was remarkably different from anything he had said during his first 15 years as king, talking about strength that came from connection rather than isolation, about the importance of choosing mercy when it served justice, about how sometimes the greatest changes came from being willing to grow and adapt, rather than remaining rigidly committed to old ways. He talked about his mate, how she had crossed his borders and disrupted his entire existence and made him better in the process, and how he hoped that the North would continue to grow and change as well, becoming a kingdom that was strong without being cruel, protective, without being oppressive. Sarah gave a much shorter speech, because she was still learning to be comfortable with public speaking, but what she said resonated deeply with many who heard it. She talked about her journey from powerless Omega running for her life to queen of the most powerful territory in the lands, acknowledging how surreal that transformation was, while also using it to make a point. Every wolf deserved the chance to determine their own path, to make choices about their own lives, to be valued for who they were, rather than dismissed because of their designation or background. She promised to use her position to advocate for those who did not have voices, to push for continued reforms that made the North safer and more just for everyone, and to never forget what it felt like to be invisible and afraid, because that memory would keep her grounded in what really mattered. After the formal ceremonies ended, and the celebration moved into the less structured phase of dancing and drinking and socializing, Kyle and Sarah slipped away from the crowds, escaping to the northern watchtower where he had stood alone in a snowstorm 1 year earlier, waiting for something he had not known he needed. They stood together looking out at the kingdom spread below them, the lights from thousands of homes creating a constellation of warmth against the frozen landscape. And Sarah leaned back against Kyle's chest while his arms came around her waist, both of them, comfortable in a silence that no longer felt empty. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly after a while. "Taking the risk of saving me instead of following the law you had enforced for 15 years? Letting me change things in your kingdom and your life?" She felt Kyle's chin rest on top of her head, felt his deep breath that stirred her hair, felt through their bond the absolute certainty of his response before he even spoke. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "You crashed into my life and destroyed my carefully constructed isolation and forced me to feel things I thought I was incapable of feeling anymore. You challenged me to be better, to grow beyond what I thought my limits were, to build something based on more than just fear and strength. My only regret is that it took 15 years and a desperate Omega in a snowstorm to make me realize that being powerful and being alone were not the same thing." He turned her around so he could look down at her face, one hand coming up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that still sometimes surprised them both. "You gave me back something I thought was lost forever. Thank you for taking the risk of trusting me, even when everything in your experience said you should not." Sarah smiled, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. "Thank you for proving you were worth that trust, for keeping your promises even when they were hard, for letting me choose you instead of forcing me into a bond I did not want." She stood on her toes to kiss him softly, feeling the mate bond hum with contentment between them. "I love you, my Winter King. My mate, my partner in reforming a kingdom and building something better than what came before. And I love you, my fierce Omega Queen, who crossed forbidden borders and changed everything," Kale responded, kissing her again with more intensity, pouring into it everything he felt but still sometimes struggled to articulate. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning, he added with a hint of the dry humor Sarah had slowly coaxed out of him, "Though I do think we should probably establish a rule that no more renegade Omegas are allowed to cross our borders during snowstorms. Once per lifetime is quite enough drama for any king to handle." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and free and full of joy that would have seemed impossible a year ago when she was running for her life through a blizzard. "Agreed. From now on, all border crossers must apply through proper channels and schedule their life-disrupting arrivals during better weather." They stood together in the tower as snow began to fall again. Gentle this time rather than violent, both of them knowing that they had found something rare and precious in the most unlikely circumstances. A love built on choice rather than compulsion, on mutual respect rather than dominance, on the willingness to grow and change together rather than remaining frozen in old patterns. The Winter King had ruled in silence for years, feared by all and close to none, until an Omega crossed his border and taught him that sometimes the greatest strength came from opening yourself to another person, despite all the risks that entailed. And the renegade Omega who had been running from captivity found that the right kind of bond, one freely chosen and constantly renewed through daily decisions to choose each other, was not a cage at all, but rather the foundation for a freedom she had never imagined possible. Together, they would continue building their kingdom and their relationship, facing whatever challenges came with the confidence that came from genuine partnership and the certainty that sometimes the most important borders to cross were not geographical, but emotional. The walls we build around our own hearts to protect ourselves from pain, but that also keep us from experiencing the transformative power of love. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the frozen territories. If you enjoyed this story of unexpected mates and second chances and kingdoms transformed by compassion, please like this video, leave a comment telling me your favorite moment, and subscribe to the channel for more supernatural romance stories that explore the depth of connection possible when two people choose to be vulnerable with each other. Until next time, may you all find someone who crashes into your life and changes everything for the better.